At the will reading, I didn't tell my niece I knew I'd get the Two-Mallory estate. Thank God I've been carrying this secret for months, and it's been eating me alive. My niece Sarah thought she had it all figured out, thought Uncle Robert's fortune would be hers because she was the devoted one, the one who visited him every Sunday with homemade cookies and fake smiles. She had no idea I knew what was really in that will. I'm Margaret, 63 years old, and I've spent most of my life being the quiet aunt in the corner. You know the type, the one family members barely acknowledge at gatherings, the one whose opinions don't matter because I never married, never had children of my own. I worked as a librarian for 40 years in our small Connecticut town, living in the same modest house my parents left me, watching everyone else build their important lives. The house itself tells the story of my existence, a simple 2-bedroom colonial built in 1952, with white clapboard siding that I paint myself every few years, and green shutters that have seen better days. The front porch sags slightly on the left side, and the screen door still squeaks the same way it did when I was 12 years old, running in and out during summer afternoons that seem to last forever. Inside, everything remains exactly as my mother left it. The floral wallpaper in the kitchen, the braided rugs in the living room, the china cabinet filled with dishes that only come out for holidays. Nobody visits me for any more. My daily routine had become as predictable as the sunrise. Wake at 6:30, coffee with 2 sugars and a splash of cream, toast with strawberry jam while listening to the local news on the old radio that sits on the kitchen windowsill. Then off to the library, where I'd spend 8 hours surrounded by books that held more conversation than most of my human interactions. The Middleton Public Library was my kingdom, a Carnegie library built in 1903 with high ceilings, tall windows, and the kind of reverent silence that comes from decades of whispered conversations and turning pages. Uncle Robert was different, though. He was my late husband's brother, and even after David passed 5 years ago, Robert kept me close. We'd have coffee every Tuesday morning at Miller's Diner on Main Street, talking about books and politics while the autumn leaves danced outside the frost-covered windows. He saw me as more than just the spinster aunt. Robert had this way of leaning forward when I spoke, his weathered hands wrapped around his coffee cup, his blue eyes focused entirely on my words, as if what I had to say actually mattered. The diner itself was a relic from the 1950s, red vinyl booths with silver trim, a black and white checkered floor that had been mopped clean every morning for 60 years, and a jukebox in the corner that still played Patsy Cline and Elvis if you fed it quarters. The waitresses knew everyone's order by heart, and the coffee was strong enough to wake the dead. It smelled like bacon grease and possibility, like the America I remembered from my childhood when things seemed simpler and people seemed kinder. But Sarah had plans. Big plans that involved Uncle Robert's $2 million estate, his Victorian mansion on Elm Street, and his collection of rare first-edition books. I could see it in her calculating green eyes every time she looked around his house, mentally redecorating, already spending money that wasn't hers yet. She'd run her manicured fingers along his antique furniture, commenting on how outdated everything looked, how much potential the place had with the right renovations. Sarah was everything I wasn't: tall, blonde, confident in that aggressive way that comes from never being told no. She worked in marketing for some tech company in Hartford, drove a BMW that cost more than I made in 2 years, and lived in one of those new developments where every house looked exactly the same but cost $500,000. She had that particular brand of entitlement that comes from growing up beautiful and never having to work for anyone's attention. What she didn't know was that 3 months ago, on a particularly cold February morning when the Connecticut wind cut through your coat like a knife, Uncle Robert had asked me to drive him to his lawyer's office because his arthritis was acting up. The roads were slick with black ice, and the bare branches of the oak trees looked like skeleton fingers against the gray sky. The humiliation happened on a Tuesday. Ironic, since Tuesdays were always our special day. I was at Miller's Diner, sitting in our usual booth by the window, waiting for Uncle Robert, as I had every week for 3 years. The red vinyl seats were cracked with age, and the coffee was always too bitter, but it was our place. I'd arrived early, as was my habit, and ordered my usual black coffee and a blueberry muffin that Dolores, the head waitress, always warmed up for me without being asked. The morning sun streamed through the diner's large front windows, casting long rectangles of light across the worn linoleum floor. Outside, Main Street was coming to life, shop owners unlocking their doors, early commuters hurrying past with travel mugs and determined expressions, the mailman making his rounds with the same methodical precision he'd maintained for the past 15 years. I was reading the Hartford Courant, trying to focus on an article about the upcoming town budget meeting, when the bell above the door chimed. I looked up expecting to see Uncle Robert's familiar figure, but instead, Sarah walked in with her perfectly styled blonde hair and designer coat, the kind that costs more than I make in 2 months. She spotted me immediately and marched over with that condescending smile she'd perfected over the years. The coat was new, a camel-colored wool blend with a fur-trimmed collar that probably came from some boutique in West Hartford. Her boots were leather, knee-high, with heels that clicked authoritatively against the floor. Everything about her screamed money and status, from her oversized designer purse to the gold jewelry that caught the morning light as she moved. "Oh, Aunt Margaret," she said, loud enough for half the diner to hear, "still playing the devoted companion, I see. You know, Uncle Robert won't be needing your services much longer." The way she said services made my cheeks burn. Mrs. Henderson from the post office was sitting 2 tables away, and I could feel her ears perking up. Old Mr. Kowalski, who came in every morning for coffee and a Danish, had stopped mid-bite to listen. Even Dolores behind the counter had slowed her movements, pretending to wipe down the same spot on the counter while straining to hear every word. Sarah slid into the booth across from me, uninvited, her movements fluid and predatory. She placed her expensive purse on the table between us like a barrier, then pulled out her phone, the latest iPhone in a case that probably cost more than my monthly electric bill. "I've been thinking," she continued, examining her manicured nails with their perfect French tips. "Maybe it's time you found some friends your own age. Uncle Robert has been telling me how tired these weekly visits make him. He's just too polite to tell you himself." The words hit me like ice water. Around us, the diner's usual morning chatter seemed to fade into a dull hum. The smell of bacon grease and coffee suddenly made me nauseous. I could feel my face flushing, that familiar heat that started at my collar and crept up my neck like a rash. My hands trembled slightly as I reached for my coffee cup, trying to maintain some semblance of dignity. "Sarah, I don't think," I began, but she cut me off with a wave of her hand, the gesture dismissive and cruel. "Don't take it personally, Aunt Margaret. It's just that family comes first, and well, you're not really family anymore, are you? Not since Uncle David died." The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear the clock on the wall ticking, the soft hiss of the coffee machine, the rustle of newspaper from the booth behind us. Mrs. Henderson had given up all pretense of eating her eggs Benedict and was staring openly now. Mr. Kowalski had set down his Danish entirely, his weathered face creased with second-hand embarrassment. Sarah stood up then, smoothing down her coat with practiced efficiency. "I'm sure you understand. It's nothing personal, just business, family business." She paused at the edge of the table, looking down at me with something that might have been pity if it hadn't been so calculated. "Maybe you could take up bridge or something. I hear the senior center has activities." She left me sitting there, alone in that booth, with every eye in the diner on me. I felt smaller than I had in years, like that awkward teenager again, always on the outside looking in. The coffee in my cup had gone cold, and the blueberry muffin sat untouched on its small white plate, suddenly looking as unappetizing as cardboard. But what Sarah didn't know was that I was carrying Uncle Robert's secret in my purse, and it was about to change everything. What would you do in my place? Would you have spoken up right then? Or would you have waited like I did? Hit that like button and subscribe if you want to see how this story unfolds. The days following Sarah's public humiliation felt like walking through fog. I kept replaying her words, the way she dismissed me so casually, as if 40 years of family history meant nothing. I found myself avoiding Main Street, taking the long way to the grocery store just to avoid Miller's Diner and the pitying looks I was sure I'd receive. My small house on Maple Street felt even quieter than usual. The grandfather clock in the hallway seemed to tick louder, marking each hour of my newfound isolation. I'd catch myself reaching for the phone to call Uncle Robert, then remembering Sarah's cruel words about how my visits tired him. The doubt she'd planted in my mind grew like a weed, choking out years of genuine affection and shared memories. The house itself seemed to echo my loneliness. Every creak of the old floorboards, every rattle of the windows when the March wind picked up, every hum of the ancient refrigerator in the kitchen, all of it amplified in the silence that had become my constant companion. I'd sit in my reading chair, the same green velvet armchair my mother had bought in 1978, surrounded by towers of books that had always been my comfort, now feeling like silent witnesses to my isolation. I started questioning everything. Had I been imposing on Uncle Robert all these years? Were our Tuesday morning conversations as meaningful to him as they were to me? Or was I just a lonely old woman clinging to the only family member who still acknowledged my existence? The uncertainty gnawed at me during those long February nights when sleep seemed as elusive as respect, but something inside me refused to surrender completely. Maybe it was 40 years of helping library patrons find exactly what they needed, or maybe it was the stubborn streak I'd inherited from my father. But I began small acts of defiance, tiny rebellions against the shame Sarah had tried to plant in me. I continued my Tuesday morning routine, but instead of going to Miller's Diner, I'd drive to the Barnes & Noble in the next town over. The drive took me through winding country roads, lined with stone walls that had been built by farmers 2 centuries ago, past red barns and pastures where horses grazed peacefully, their breath visible in the cold morning air. It was a different world from the claustrophobic small-town atmosphere where everyone knew everyone else's business. The bookstore became my sanctuary. I'd sit in their cafe with a proper cappuccino, not the bitter coffee from Miller's, and a cranberry scone that actually tasted fresh. The space was modern and bright, with floor-to-ceiling windows that let in natural light and comfortable chairs arranged in cozy clusters. I'd read the latest bestsellers, browse through travel magazines filled with places I'd never visit, and watch young mothers with their toddlers exploring the children's section with the kind of patient love I'd never experienced myself. The envelope in my purse felt heavier each day. Uncle Robert's lawyer, Mr. Patterson, had handed it to me that February morning with specific instructions. Don't open this until after the will reading, Margaret. Robert was very clear about that. His weathered hands had trembled slightly as he'd passed it to me, and I'd seen something in his eyes, respect, maybe even admiration. Patterson and Associates occupied a beautiful Victorian house that had been converted into law offices on Elm Street, just 3 blocks from Uncle Robert's mansion. The building was painted a soft yellow with white trim, and the original hardwood floors creaked pleasantly under your feet. Mr. Patterson's office was on the 2nd floor, filled with leather-bound law books and framed diplomas that spoke of decades of service to the community. 3 weeks passed before I saw Uncle Robert again. 3 weeks of second-guessing myself, of wondering if Sarah was right, of feeling like an intruder in my own family history. Then he called me himself, his voice warm and familiar over the phone, asking if I'd like to have coffee. Not at Miller's. He suggested the new place on Elm Street, closer to his house. Café Luna had opened just after Christmas, occupying the ground floor of what used to be Henderson's hardware store. The owners had kept the original tin ceiling and exposed brick walls, but added modern touches like a gleaming espresso machine and comfortable seating areas with mismatched vintage furniture. It smelled like fresh ground coffee beans and possibility. When I arrived, Uncle Robert was already there, looking frailer than I remembered, but with that same kind smile that had always made me feel seen. He was sitting at a small table near the window, wearing his favorite cardigan, the brown one with leather elbow patches that his late wife had given him for their 40th anniversary. His silver hair was neatly combed, and his blue eyes lit up when he saw me. "Margaret," he said, taking my hand across the small table, his skin paper-thin, but his grip still firm. "I heard about what happened at Miller's. I'm sorry you had to endure that." The way he said it told me everything. He knew. He'd always known exactly who Sarah was, and more importantly, he knew exactly who I was too. Something was about to change, and I could feel it in the crisp March air that carried the promise of spring and the weight of secrets finally ready to be revealed. The decision came to me on a quiet Sunday morning in late March. I was sitting in my kitchen, watching the first crocuses push through the snow in my backyard, when I realized I was done being the victim of Sarah's narrative. The envelope from Mr. Patterson sat on my kitchen table like a talisman, reminding me that I held knowledge that could change everything. The kitchen was my favorite room in the house, small but efficient, with yellow walls that my mother had painted in 1985, and white cabinets that had been updated sometime in the 90s. The window above the sink looked out onto my modest backyard, where I'd planted a vegetable garden every summer for the past 20 years. Even in March, I could see the raised beds I'd built myself, waiting patiently under the last patches of snow for another season of tomatoes, peppers, and herbs. I began to plan, not for revenge, but for dignity. I started visiting Uncle Robert again, but this time I was different, more confident, more present. The shame that Sarah had tried to impose on me was lifting like morning fog, replaced by something I hadn't felt in years: purpose. We'd sit in his library, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with leather-bound classics, the afternoon sunlight streaming through his tall windows and casting golden rectangles across the Persian rugs. The room was magnificent, easily the size of my entire living room, with a marble fireplace that dominated one wall and comfortable reading chairs positioned to catch the best light. The house smelled of old books and the lavender tea he'd taken to drinking for his arthritis, mixed with the faint scent of lemon oil from the weekly cleaning service. Uncle Robert's mansion was a testament to another era, built in 1887 by a railroad baron, with 12 rooms, original hardwood floors, and architectural details that modern builders couldn't replicate if they tried. The front staircase was a work of art, with hand-carved banisters and a stained-glass window on the landing that threw rainbow patterns across the walls when the sun hit it just right. Sarah saw dollar signs when she looked at this house. I saw history, craftsmanship, and the weight of generations. "You seem lighter lately, Margaret," Uncle Robert observed one afternoon, his blue eyes twinkling behind wire-rimmed glasses. We were discussing Steinbeck's East of Eden, and I'd just made a point about the nature of inherited guilt that seemed to surprise him. He was wearing his favorite reading sweater, a soft gray cashmere that had seen better days but was too comfortable to replace. "I think I'm finally learning to value myself the way others value me," I replied, and he smiled that knowing smile that had always made me feel like he could see straight through to my soul. Meanwhile, Sarah's visits to Uncle Robert became more frequent and more transparent. She'd arrive with elaborate meals she'd clearly ordered from expensive restaurants, trying to pass them off as homemade. The containers were always too perfect, the portions too precise, the flavors too complex for someone who'd once burned water trying to make instant coffee. She'd bring real estate magazines, casually mentioning how much property values had increased in the neighborhood. "Did you know the Morrison place sold for $1.8 million last month?" she'd say, flipping through glossy pages of luxury homes. "And it doesn't have half the character of this place." Her voice would take on that calculating tone I'd learned to recognize, the same one she'd used when discussing Uncle Robert's tiredness at Miller's Diner. She even started bringing her teenage daughter Emma, coaching her to call him Great Uncle Bobby, and ask about his collection of old books. Emma was 15, with Sarah's blonde hair but none of her mother's calculating nature. The poor girl looked uncomfortable during these visits, clearly aware she was being used as a prop in her mother's performance, but too young to know how to resist. I watched it all with a mixture of sadness and anticipation. Sarah was so focused on securing her inheritance that she never noticed the way Uncle Robert's jaw tightened when she spoke, or how his hands would clench slightly when she'd interrupt him mid-sentence to point out something in those real estate magazines. She was tone-deaf to the subtle signs of his growing irritation, too blinded by greed to see what was happening right in front of her. The spring air in Connecticut was crisp and full of possibility. Dogwood trees bloomed along Elm Street, their white petals creating a canopy over the sidewalks where I'd walk each morning, preparing myself for what was coming. The town was waking up from its winter hibernation. Shop owners were putting out sidewalk displays. The park department was planting flowers in the town square. And everywhere you looked, there were signs of renewal and rebirth. I could feel the weight of justice approaching, and for the first time in months, I slept peacefully. The will reading was scheduled for the first week of April. Sarah had no idea that her carefully constructed world was about to crumble, and I had no intention of warning her. What would you do if you were in my position? Would you have given her a hint, or would you have let justice take its course? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for the next part of this story. The days leading up to the will reading were filled with a strange mixture of anticipation and melancholy. Uncle Robert passed peacefully in his sleep on a rainy Thursday night in early April, just as the cherry blossoms were reaching full bloom outside his bedroom window. I was one of the last people to see him alive. We'd had our usual Tuesday coffee, and he'd seemed more at peace than I'd seen him in years. That final Tuesday at Café Luna had been different somehow. Uncle Robert had ordered his usual black coffee with 1 sugar, but he'd barely touched it. Instead, he'd spent most of our time together talking about legacy, about what we leave behind when we're gone. His voice had been softer than usual, more reflective, as if he were already beginning to let go of this world. "Margaret," he'd said, holding my hand as we sat in his sunroom surrounded by the orchids he'd cultivated for decades. "Promise me you'll remember that worth isn't measured by how loudly someone claims it, but by how quietly someone demonstrates it." The sunroom was his pride and joy, a glass-enclosed space he'd added to the back of the house in the 1990s, filled with exotic plants that required careful attention and precise conditions. Phalaenopsis orchids in shades of white and purple line the shelves, their delicate blooms a testament to his patience and dedication. The room caught the morning sun perfectly, and on that last Tuesday, the light had seemed almost ethereal as it filtered through the glass and danced across the leaves. The funeral was a small affair at St. Mary's Episcopal Church on Main Street. The building was over a century old, with stained glass windows that cast rainbow patterns across the wooden pews. The church had that particular smell of old wood and candle wax that spoke of generations of worship, baptisms, weddings, and farewells. Uncle Robert had been a member here for 60 years, serving on the vestry and helping with the annual Christmas pageant until arthritis made it too difficult. Sarah played the grieving niece perfectly, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief and accepting condolences with practiced grace. She wore an expensive black dress that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, something designer with clean lines and subtle details that screamed money without being obvious about it. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a perfect chignon, and her makeup was flawless despite the tears she claimed to be shedding. I sat in the third row, wearing my simple black suit from JCPenney, listening to her tell Mrs. Henderson about all the sacrifices she'd made to care for Uncle Robert in his final years. The irony wasn't lost on me. She was already rehearsing her story for when she inherited everything. She spoke of missed opportunities, of turning down promotions to spend time with family, of the burden she'd willingly shouldered out of love and duty. "He was like a father to me," she told the small gathering at the reception in the church basement, her voice catching just enough to sound genuine. "I don't know how I'll go on without his guidance." She was standing near the coffee table, surrounded by well-meaning neighbors who nodded sympathetically and offered their own stories of loss and grief. During those quiet days between the funeral and the will reading, I found myself taking long walks through our small Connecticut town. The streets were lined with colonial-style houses, their shutters painted in traditional colors, deep blues, forest greens, and warm reds. Spring was asserting itself with determination. Tulips pushed through the last patches of snow in carefully tended gardens, and the air carried the scent of fresh earth and possibility. Our town was the kind of place where people still knew their neighbors, where the same families had lived for generations, where change came slowly and tradition mattered. Main Street was lined with locally owned businesses. Murphy's Hardware, where 3 generations of Murphys had sold everything from nails to lawnmowers. Rossetti's Market, where you could still get your groceries on credit if times were tough. And the Middleton Inn, a bed and breakfast that had been operating continuously since 1823. I spent hours in my garden, planting the tomato seedlings I'd started on my kitchen windowsill back in February. There was something therapeutic about working with my hands, preparing for a future I couldn't quite envision yet, but somehow knew would be different. The soil was rich and dark, full of earthworms, and the promise of another growing season. I planted 6 varieties of tomatoes, along with peppers, herbs, and a row of sunflowers that would tower over everything else by midsummer. The envelope from Mr. Patterson remained unopened on my kitchen table, but its presence had become a source of strength rather than anxiety. Sometimes I'd catch myself looking at it while I had my morning coffee, wondering what Uncle Robert had written, what secrets it contained, what justice it might deliver. Sarah called me twice during that week, her voice sickeningly sweet as she talked about family obligations and how we'd need to work together to handle Uncle Robert's affairs. She even suggested I might want to take a few keepsakes before the estate was settled, as if she were already the benevolent heir distributing charity to the less fortunate relatives. "I know Uncle Robert would want you to have something to remember him by," she'd said during our second conversation, her tone dripping with false generosity. "Maybe one of his books? I know how much you both enjoyed reading together." The night before the will reading, I couldn't sleep. I sat in my reading chair with a cup of chamomile tea, watching the moon cast silver shadows across my living room walls. The grandfather clock chimed midnight, then 1, then 2. I wasn't nervous exactly. I was ready. Ready for truth, ready for justice, ready for Sarah to learn that all her calculations had been wrong. Tomorrow, the envelope would finally be opened, and I would finally understand why Uncle Robert had trusted me with his secret for all these months. The morning of the will reading arrived with the kind of crisp April sunshine that makes everything look possible. I woke before my alarm, feeling more alert than I had in months. The envelope from Mr. Patterson sat on my nightstand where I'd moved it the night before, and I finally opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a handwritten letter from Uncle Robert, dated 3 months earlier, the same day he'd asked me to drive him to the lawyer's office. His familiar script filled 2 pages of cream-colored stationery, and as I read, tears began streaming down my face. "My dearest Margaret," it began, "if you're reading this, then my time has come and gone, and you're about to witness something I've been planning for quite some time. You see, I've known about Sarah's true nature for years, her greed, her manipulation, her complete lack of genuine affection for anyone but herself. What she doesn't know is that I've been testing her, watching her reveal exactly who she is with every visit, every calculated gesture, every transparent attempt to secure what she believes is rightfully hers." The letter went on to explain that Uncle Robert had changed his will 6 months ago after overhearing Sarah on the phone with a friend, laughing about how easy it would be to manage the old man, and discussing her plans to sell his house and donate his books to get the tax write-off. He'd been standing in his own hallway, invisible to her as she sat in his kitchen, plotting his future as if he were already dead. "But you, Margaret," the letter continued, "you've shown me nothing but genuine love and respect. You listen when I speak. You remember the stories I tell. You care about my opinions and my feelings. You've never once asked me about my will or my money. You've never suggested I change anything about my house or my life. You've simply been present, and that presence has meant more to me than you'll ever know." I was still crying when I arrived at Patterson and Associates at 10 o'clock sharp. The Victorian house looked exactly the same as it had 3 months ago, but everything felt different now. I climbed the creaking stairs to Mr. Patterson's office, my heart pounding with anticipation and something that felt remarkably like vindication. Sarah was already there, of course, sitting in one of the leather chairs across from Mr. Patterson's massive oak desk. She was dressed in what I'd come to think of as her serious business outfit, a navy blue suit with gold buttons, her hair pulled back in a severe bun, her expression appropriately solemn for the occasion. She'd brought her husband, Mark, a thin, nervous man who worked in insurance and always looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Oh, Aunt Margaret," Sarah said as I entered, her voice dripping with false sympathy, "I'm so glad you could make it. I know this must be difficult for you." Mr. Patterson was a distinguished man in his 70s, with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He'd been Uncle Robert's lawyer for over 30 years, and I could see the weight of what he was about to reveal in the set of his shoulders, the careful way he arranged the papers on his desk. "Before we begin," he said, his voice formal but gentle, "I want you both to know that Robert spent considerable time on these arrangements. Every decision was made with great care and deliberation." Sarah leaned forward slightly, her green eyes bright with anticipation. I could practically see her mental calculator working, adding up property values and investment portfolios. She'd probably already picked out new furniture for the mansion, maybe even contacted a real estate agent to get a market assessment. Mr. Patterson opened the will and began to read. The formal language seemed to go on forever, legal terminology about sound mind and disposing of worldly goods, but I could see Sarah's confidence growing with every word. This was it, her moment of triumph, the validation of all her careful planning and manipulation. Then came the bombshell. "To my niece, Sarah Mitchell, who has shown such interest in my financial affairs, I leave the sum of $1 to be paid in cash, along with my heartfelt hope that she will learn to value relationships over money." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, then dawning horror as the reality of what she'd just heard began to sink in. Her carefully applied makeup couldn't hide the way all color drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking pale and suddenly much older than her 42 years. "I'm sorry. Could you repeat that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Mr. Patterson's expression remained professionally neutral, but I caught the slightest twinkle in his eyes as he continued. The remainder of my estate, including my house at 247 Elm Street, my investment portfolio, my book collection, and all other assets totaling approximately $2 million, I leave to my dear friend Margaret Thompson, who has shown me what true family really means. Sarah's reaction was immediate and devastating. She let out a sound that was part gasp, part sob, and part scream of pure rage. Her husband reached for her arm, but she shook him off violently, standing up so quickly that her chair nearly toppled over. "This is impossible," she shrieked, her carefully maintained composure completely shattered. "He promised me. He told me I was like a daughter to him. This has to be a mistake." But Mr. Patterson wasn't finished. He looked directly at Sarah, his voice taking on a slightly sharper edge. "Robert also asked me to read this personal message to you, Sarah. I hope you understand that actions have consequences, and that the love you pretend to feel cannot be inherited like money. Perhaps this will teach you to value the people in your life before it's too late." The tears streaming down Sarah's face weren't tears of grief anymore. They were tears of pure, unadulterated fury. She turned to me, her eyes blazing with hatred and accusation. "You did this," she spat, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You manipulated him. You turned him against his own family." I sat there in stunned silence, still processing what had just happened. $2 million. Uncle Robert's beautiful house, his precious books. All of it mine. Not because I'd asked for it or schemed for it, but because I'd simply been myself. What would you do if you were in my place? How would you handle this moment of ultimate justice? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to see how this incredible story concludes. The aftermath of the will reading was unlike anything I could have imagined. Sarah's breakdown in Mr. Patterson's office was just the beginning of what would become the most dramatic week of my quiet life. After her initial explosion of rage and disbelief, Sarah had stormed out of the office, dragging her bewildered husband behind her. But not before she'd made several threats that Mr. Patterson calmly noted for the record. She was going to contest the will, she declared. She was going to prove I'd manipulated Uncle Robert, that he wasn't of sound mind, that I'd used some kind of undue influence to steal what was rightfully hers. "Good luck with that, Mr. Patterson," had said mildly after she'd gone, his professional demeanor slipping just enough to reveal a hint of satisfaction. Robert anticipated this reaction. He had a complete psychological evaluation done just 2 months ago, specifically to prevent any challenges to his mental capacity. Dr. Morrison's report is quite thorough. Robert was sharp as a tack right up until the end. The news of Uncle Robert's will spread through our small town like wildfire. In a place where everyone knew everyone else's business, a $2 million inheritance was the kind of gossip that could sustain conversations for months. By the time I made my first trip to Miller's Diner since Sarah's public humiliation of me, the entire town was buzzing with speculation and opinions. Dolores, the head waitress who'd witnessed Sarah's cruel performance weeks earlier, greeted me with a smile that could have powered the entire diner. "Well, well, well," she said, pouring my coffee without being asked. "Looks like somebody got exactly what they deserved, and somebody else got exactly what they had coming." The transformation in how people treated me was immediate, and frankly, a little overwhelming. Mrs. Henderson from the post office, who'd barely acknowledged my existence for 20 years, suddenly wanted to chat about my wonderful relationship with Uncle Robert. Mr. Kowalski, who'd witnessed my humiliation firsthand, now tipped his hat when he saw me on the street and asked about my plans for that beautiful house. But it wasn't just the money that had changed things. It was the validation. Uncle Robert's will was a public declaration that I mattered, that my quiet presence and genuine care had been seen and valued. For someone who'd spent most of her life feeling invisible, this recognition was almost more valuable than the inheritance itself. The house on Elm Street was mine now, all 12 rooms of Victorian splendor that Sarah had been so eager to renovate and modernize. I spent my first afternoon there alone, walking through rooms I'd visited dozens of times, but never really examined as an owner. The master bedroom where Uncle Robert had slept for 40 years, with its 4-poster bed and view of the garden. The formal dining room with its crystal chandelier and mahogany table that could seat 12. The kitchen with its vintage appliances and breakfast nook where he'd eaten his morning oatmeal every day for decades. But it was the library that truly took my breath away. floor-to-ceiling shelves filled with first editions, rare manuscripts, and books that Uncle Robert had collected over a lifetime of careful curation. As a librarian, I understood the value of this collection in ways that Sarah never could have. These weren't just assets to be liquidated. They were treasures, each one chosen with care and love. Among the books, I found more letters from Uncle Robert, tucked between pages like bookmarks. One was hidden in his copy of Pride and Prejudice, another in To Kill a Mockingbird. Each one revealed more about his decision to leave everything to me, about how he'd watched Sarah's behavior evolve from merely selfish to actively cruel, about how my simple presence had brought him comfort in his final years. "You never asked for anything, Margaret," one letter read, "and that's exactly why you deserve everything." The legal challenges Sarah had threatened materialized quickly. Within a week of the will reading, I received a formal notice that she was contesting the will on grounds of undue influence and diminished capacity. Her lawyer, a sharp-dressed man from Hartford who specialized in estate disputes, had clearly convinced her that she had a case. But Mr. Patterson had been right about Uncle Robert's preparation. The psychological evaluation was just the beginning. There were also video recordings. Uncle Robert had apparently been documenting his decision-making process for months, creating a detailed record of his mental state and his reasons for changing the will. There were witness statements from his doctor, his housekeeper, even the mailman, all testifying to his sharp mind and clear intentions. Most damaging to Sarah's case were the recordings Uncle Robert had made of her visits. Apparently, he'd been so disturbed by her behavior that he'd started recording their conversations, capturing her calculating comments about property values, her dismissive remarks about his old-fashioned lifestyle, and most damning of all, a phone conversation where she'd discussed selling the house the minute the old man kicks the bucket. The town was divided in its reactions. Some people, particularly those who'd known Sarah since childhood, seemed genuinely shocked by the revelations about her character. Others, like Dolores at the diner, claimed they'd seen through her act years ago. "That girl always was too pretty for her own good," Mrs. Henderson observed during one of our newfound conversations. "Never had to work for anything, never learned the value of kindness." As the days passed, I began to understand that Uncle Robert's gift to me wasn't just financial. It was a lesson in justice, in the power of quiet dignity over loud demands, in the importance of genuine relationships over calculated ones. The cherry blossoms outside my new bedroom window were in full bloom, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was blooming too. The confrontation I'd been dreading finally came on a rainy Thursday evening in late April. I was in Uncle Robert's library, my library now, cataloging the rare book collection when I heard the front doorbell ring. Through the tall windows, I could see Sarah's BMW parked in the circular driveway, its headlights cutting through the gathering dusk. I'd been expecting this moment for weeks. The legal challenge to the will was proceeding exactly as Mr. Patterson had predicted, slowly and unsuccessfully. Sarah's lawyer had reviewed all of Uncle Robert's documentation and quietly advised her that she had virtually no chance of overturning the will. But Sarah wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully, especially not when it came to $2 million she'd considered her birthright. When I opened the front door, Sarah looked like a different person from the polished, confident woman who'd humiliated me at Miller's Diner. Her usually perfect hair was disheveled, her makeup smeared from crying, and her expensive clothes looked like she'd slept in them. Behind her, the rain was coming down in sheets, turning the spring evening into something dark and dramatic. "We need to talk," she said, pushing past me into the foyer without waiting for an invitation. The marble floor was slick with rainwater from her coat, and her heels clicked ominously as she paced back and forth beneath the crystal chandelier. "Sarah," I began, but she cut me off with a gesture that was both desperate and furious. "Do you have any idea what you've done to me?" she demanded, her voice cracking with emotion. "Do you understand what this inheritance means? I've already put my house on the market. I've made commitments based on money that was supposed to be mine." I led her into the front parlor, the formal sitting room that Uncle Robert had rarely used, but that seemed appropriate for this kind of confrontation. The room was elegant, but intimidating, with its antique furniture and oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors who weren't even related to us. I sat in one of the wingback chairs, trying to project a calm I didn't entirely feel. "Sarah, I never asked for this," I said quietly. I had no idea what Uncle Robert was planning. "Bullshit!" she exploded, jumping up from her chair and beginning to pace again. "You manipulated him. You played the poor, lonely widow and made him feel sorry for you. You turned him against his own family." The accusation stung, partly because I could see how someone might interpret it that way. From the outside, it probably did look suspicious, the quiet librarian who suddenly inherits a fortune from a wealthy relative. But I knew the truth, and more importantly, Uncle Robert had known the truth. "I never asked him for anything," I repeated, my voice steady despite the turmoil in my chest. "I never even knew he was wealthy until after David died and he started including me in family gatherings. Our relationship was never about money." "Then give it back!" Sarah shrieked, her composure completely shattered now. "If you don't care about the money, then give it to me. I'm his real family. I'm the one who should inherit everything." The rain outside was getting heavier, drumming against the tall windows and creating a soundtrack for this moment of reckoning. I looked at Sarah, really looked at her, and for the first time, I felt something approaching pity. She was so consumed by greed, so blinded by her sense of entitlement, that she couldn't see how her own actions had led to this moment. "Do you want to know what Uncle Robert really thought of you?" I asked, my voice still quiet but carrying a new edge of steel. "Do you want to know why he changed his will?" Sarah stopped pacing and stared at me, her green eyes wide with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. I walked to the antique secretary desk in the corner and pulled out one of Uncle Robert's letters, not one of the personal ones he'd left for me, but one he'd specifically written to be shared with Sarah if this moment ever came. "He wrote this for you," I said, holding out the cream-colored envelope. "He wanted you to understand." Sarah snatched the letter from my hands and tore it open with shaking fingers. As she read, I watched her face go through a series of emotions: confusion, recognition, shame, and finally, a kind of broken understanding. The letter was devastating in its quiet honesty. Uncle Robert had documented specific instances of Sarah's greed and manipulation, her casual cruelty toward me, her complete lack of genuine affection for him as a person, rather than as a source of inheritance. He'd written about overhearing her phone conversations, about watching her calculate the value of his possessions, about the way she'd dismissed his interests and opinions as the ramblings of an old man. But most of all, the letter concluded, "I want you to understand that love cannot be inherited, Sarah. It must be given freely and genuinely, without expectation of reward. Margaret gave me that gift every Tuesday morning for 3 years, never asking for anything in return. You gave me performance and manipulation, always with an eye toward what you could gain. The choice of who to leave my worldly goods to was, in the end, quite simple." When Sarah finished reading, she crumpled the letter in her fist and threw it across the room, but the fight had gone out of her. She collapsed back into the chair, her shoulders shaking with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep and broken inside her. "I loved him," she whispered, but even she seemed to know how hollow the words sounded. "No," I said gently. "You loved what he could give you. There's a difference." We sat in silence for a long time, listening to the rain and the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Finally, Sarah looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. "What am I supposed to do now?" she asked, and for the first time since I'd known her, she sounded genuinely vulnerable. "You could try learning the lesson Uncle Robert was trying to teach you," I suggested. "You could start valuing people for who they are instead of what they can do for you." Sarah left that night without another word, walking out into the rain like a ghost of her former self. I watched from the window as her taillights disappeared into the darkness, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Not triumph, but a deep, profound sadness for what she'd lost and what she'd never really had. The next morning, I found the crumpled letter on the parlor floor and smoothed it out carefully. Uncle Robert's words deserved better than to be thrown away in anger, even if the person they were meant for wasn't ready to hear them. What would you do if someone you'd known your whole life revealed themselves to be so different from who you thought they were? How do you forgive someone who can't forgive themselves? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for the final chapter of this incredible journey. 6 months have passed since that rainy night when Sarah left my house in tears, and I'm writing this from the sunroom where Uncle Robert and I had our last conversation. The orchids he tended so carefully are thriving under my care, their delicate blooms a testament to the patience and love he taught me to value. The legal challenges to the will were finally dismissed last month. Sarah's lawyer had advised her to drop the case after reviewing all of Uncle Robert's documentation, and she'd reluctantly agreed. The inheritance is officially, legally, and completely mine now, all $2 million of it, along with this beautiful house and everything in it. But the real inheritance wasn't the money or the property. It was the lesson Uncle Robert taught me about my own worth, about the value of quiet dignity and genuine relationships. For 63 years, I'd lived my life believing I was somehow less important than other people, that my opinions didn't matter, that my presence was barely tolerated. Uncle Robert's final gift to me was the knowledge that I was wrong about all of that. I've made some changes to the house, but not the kind Sarah would have made. I've converted one of the smaller bedrooms into a reading room for the local book club, which now meets here every other Wednesday. The ladies who come are mostly my age or older, women who, like me, had been overlooked or undervalued for too long. We read everything from classic literature to contemporary fiction, and our discussions are lively and passionate in ways that would have surprised our younger selves. Mrs. Henderson from the post office has become an unexpected friend. It turns out she's been writing poetry for 40 years, but never shared it with anyone because her late husband told her it was silly. Last week, she read one of her poems to our book club, and there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Sometimes the most beautiful flowers bloom latest in the season. I've also established a small scholarship fund at the local high school for students who want to study library science or literature. It's not a huge amount, just enough to help one student each year pursue their dreams of working with books. The first recipient is Emma, Sarah's daughter, who wrote a beautiful essay about the power of stories to change lives. I hope her mother will see it as the olive branch it's meant to be. Speaking of Sarah, I see her occasionally around town. She looks older now, more subdued, and she's stopped wearing the expensive clothes and jewelry that used to be her armor. Her husband, Mark, told someone at the hardware store that they're going to marriage counseling, trying to rebuild their relationship on something more solid than financial expectations. I hope they succeed. Sarah and I don't speak when we pass each other on the street, but there's no longer any hostility in her eyes, just a kind of resigned sadness that breaks my heart a little. I've thought about reaching out to her, about trying to bridge the gap that Uncle Robert's will created between us, but I'm not sure she's ready for that conversation yet. Some wounds need time to heal before they can be properly tended. The house on Elm Street has become a gathering place in ways it never was when Uncle Robert lived here alone. The book club meetings, the scholarship interviews, the quiet dinners I host for other women who found themselves alone later in life, all of it has filled these rooms with laughter and conversation and the kind of warmth that comes from genuine human connection. I still work part-time at the library because I love the work and because I've learned that purpose isn't something you retire from. But now I have the freedom to travel, to take classes, to explore interests I never had time for when I was worried about making ends meet. Last month, I took a cooking class in Tuscany, something I never would have dreamed of doing before Uncle Robert's gift changed my life. The most surprising change has been in how other people see me. I'm no longer the invisible widow in the corner, the one whose opinions don't matter. I'm Margaret Thompson, the woman who inherited the Elm Street mansion, the one who hosts the book club and funds scholarships and travels to Italy to learn about pasta. It's amazing how money changes people's perceptions, but it's even more amazing how self-respect changes everything else. I've learned that justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about recognition, about seeing people for who they really are and valuing them accordingly. Uncle Robert's will wasn't just about punishing Sarah for her greed. It was about rewarding me for my loyalty, my kindness, my simple human decency. As I sit here in the sunroom, watching the late afternoon sun filter through the glass and cast golden patterns across the orchid leaves, I think about the letter Uncle Robert left me, the one that started with, "My dearest Margaret." In it, he wrote something I've memorized and carry with me every day. "You taught me that the most valuable things in life cannot be bought or sold. They can only be given freely from one heart to another." I understand now that I was never the poor relation, the spinster aunt, the woman who didn't matter. I was the one who knew how to love without expecting anything in return. And in the end, that made all the difference. The grandfather clock in the hallway is chiming 5 o'clock, and the book club will be arriving soon for our discussion of The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. I should start the coffee and arrange the chairs in the library. But first, I want to water Uncle Robert's orchids and tell them about my day, the way he used to do. Some people might think it's silly, talking to flowers. But I've learned that the most important conversations often happen in the quiet moments, when we're brave enough to speak our truth to the world, whether anyone is listening or not. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, someone is listening after all.